Hello, everyone. So my name is Becky Chen. I'm a professor at OAC, University of Toronto. I'm very happy to be here. Eve invited me to attend this conference, but she said I could also give a workshop. So this is not a research presentation per se. The research presentation will take place on Friday when I give the conference presentation. I wanted to use this opportunity to introduce to you dynamic assessment. This is an area that I started learning about 3 years ago. So I did a project with researchers in the Netherlands on dynamic assessment of lexical specificity. I'll tell you what it's about in a little bit. But overall, I became very interested in dynamic assessment. It's not just about lexical specificity. It can be used, this is a method that can be used in many different areas, including children's language and literacy development. So today, I'm going to tell you what dynamic assessment is about, and its, I guess, strengths compared to traditional forms of assessment. And I'll give you some examples of dynamic assessment, both in English and also in Chinese. And then I'll also, I guess, discuss some potential issues and problems with dynamic assessment. I wanted this workshop to be as interactive as possible. So if you have questions at any point, please stop me and feel free to ask your questions. Okay, so what is dynamic assessment? I don't know if you have heard of this before. It's becoming more popular these days, but as I will tell you in a little bit, it's actually the method has been around for a very long time, but nowadays it's becoming more and more popular because it has many strengths compared to traditional form of assessment. So dynamic assessment refers to assessment that involves an active teaching process. So it combines teaching and assessment. So it's not just assessing or testing children. It integrates both instruction and assessment. But why do we do that? Why do we want to teach children when we assess them? Because the goal of dynamic assessment is not to find out what children know already. Rather, the goal is to identify their learning potential. In other words, we want to know whether they can learn quickly. You know, some children are quick learners. They have a very strong learning ability, but other children, they may have learning disabilities. So dynamic assessment is very useful for identifying their learning potential. That's why we want to teach them and observe their learning process during the assessment, so that we can identify their learning potential. In comparison, traditional forms of assessment, I will call it static assessment as opposed to dynamic, just for the sake of comparison. Traditional static assessment, on the other hand, focuses on the child's current level of performance. So when we give children a test, we want to find out what they know and what they don't know already. So the focus is to assess their knowledge. But when we use dynamic assessment, we're not interested in what they know or don't know. We're interested in how well they learn, whether they can learn very quickly, which is very good, or whether they have a learning disability. And if they have a learning disability, and then they need to receive special treatment, where we call that early intervention. So that's why we use dynamic assessment. And then I wanted to give you a little bit of history of dynamic assessment. even though it's becoming more popular nowadays, it's actually not a very new idea. The idea initially emerged in the 1920s and early 1930s. So it's been around for a very long time, and it's rooted in Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. If you guys are education students, I'm sure you have heard of the zone of proximal development, right? So the idea is, so this is from a teacher's perspective. So when you teach, right, you want to adjust your teaching so that you don't tell children what they know already, because that would be a waste of time. And then you don't want to teach something that's so difficult that children cannot learn, and that would also be a waste of time. So here we have 3 circles. So what I can do, so that's what the skills or knowledge they have already. And then this is what I can do, so that will be beyond their zone of proximal development. That means it's too challenging. So when you teach, your goal is to bring children from the green zone to the purple zone. So that's the zone, what I can do with some help from the teacher. So that's the zone of proximal development. So based on Vygotsky's theory, from the perspective of the teacher or the instructor, when you teach, the important thing is to identify that zone of proximal development so you can teach to that zone. You don't want your teaching materials to be too easy or too difficult, right? So dynamic assessment is based on the same notion. So what we want to find out is children's learning potential, and the learning potential is similar to this zone of proximal development. Okay, I think that's pretty good. So before I get into the benefits of dynamic assessment, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about problems with static, which means the traditional forms of assessment. So traditional form of assessment has several problems. One is it yields low performance in children from disadvantaged backgrounds. That means if a child comes from, say, a low SES family, and the child doesn't have a lot of opportunities to learn and to grow, the child is going to do poorly on the traditional form of assessment, but that doesn't necessarily mean the child has a learning disability. So if you use a traditional, say a standardized measure, and the child does poorly, then you cannot tell the reason for that. Is it because the child hasn't had a lot of opportunities to learn, or is it because the child has potentially a learning disability? So the static test will now be able to differentiate between the two. Because I'm in Canada and I work with bilingual populations in Canada, and that also includes immigrant children. So the same can be applied to immigrant children because they just arrived in a new country. It takes them time to adapt to the new environment. So they're not familiar with these standardized tests used in Canada. If you give them standardized measures, they may do very poorly. But is that because they have a learning disability, or is it because they just need more time to, to learn the procedures for these tests? So static tests will now be able to differentiate between the two scenarios. Another problem for static measures is that these measures focus on performance rather than processes. So it's not very informative for teachers. So it tells, a static test tells the teacher what the child knows or doesn't know already, but it doesn't tell the teacher how children learn. Because dynamic assessment combines instruction with assessment, the teacher or the tester can observe how the child learns and then identify, the learning processes, and these processes then will be very useful for teaching. Okay. I think I kind of mentioned these things already, so this is kind of a quick summary. So why is dynamic assessment useful? So dynamic assessment useful for mainly two reasons. One is it can identify children's learning potential, which is very useful, to differentiate between children who haven't had a lot of opportunities to learn from children who have learning disabilities. So children with learning disabilities, they have cognitive deficits. Even with opportunities, they may still fall behind. Another reason is dynamic assessment can identify learning processes. So it allows the teacher or the tester to observe how children learn and then use that information to inform their teaching. And dynamic assessment is particularly useful for disadvantaged populations. So I'll just kind of go through all of these populations and explain why that's the reason. So for low SES children, and because they don't, their parents are not well educated, they don't have a lot of educational opportunities at home, their parents are busy with multiple jobs, doing multiple jobs, or do not have resources to hire tutors, so that they may perform poorly on standardized measures. But if you use dynamic measures, you see that, in fact, they may be very good learners, they just haven't had the opportunities to learn. And the same can be said of immigrant children. So immigrant children just arrived in their new country. They're not familiar with the new environment. They're not familiar with the educational system or the procedures of standardized measures. So because of those factors, they may perform poorly on static measures. Dynamic assessment is also useful for children with learning disabilities. That's because for those children, oftentimes it's very difficult to understand the nature or requirements of standardized measures. When you give them a standardized measure, they don't understand what's going on and why you're doing this. But if you give them a dynamic measure, you can take the time to work with them, and oftentimes they will perform better. For my own research, I deal with immigrant children, but I also work with children who are enrolled in bilingual programs. I don't know if you're familiar with the situation in Canada. Both English and French are official languages of Canada. So a lot of English-speaking children, they actually go to French schools, and we call those schools French immersion schools. When they go to school, they're educated entirely in French, which is their second language. But they do not speak French outside of school or at home because their parents are English speakers. So it's a very interesting situation. But for children who go to those schools, again, it's very difficult to identify children who have learning disabilities because they're educated in their second language. It takes several years for them to gain proficiency in French. So say they start the program in grade 1 in French, but if you assess them in grade 1 in French at this time, they do very poorly because they haven't had opportunities to learn French yet. So the typical practice is to wait for 3 or 4 years until they gain proficiency in French before you can assess them for learning disabilities or reading disabilities. But the wait time is too long. By that time, it's too late to provide intervention for children with disabilities. So the idea here is you can use dynamic assessment to assess those children. So it's not about how much they know in French already, it's about how quickly they can learn French. And also, we operate on the principle of cross-language transfer. So oftentimes we assess them in English, and we use their performance or their success in English to predict how successful they will be in French. I'll actually talk more about that at my conference presentation. Okay, so I said all of these good things about dynamic assessment, but how do we do dynamic assessment? So now I'm just going to give you some examples of dynamic assessment. Of course, I don't claim to be an expert in this area because I've only been doing this for a few years, and researchers spend a lot of time and resources on developing dynamic assessment tools. So with time, I'm continuing to do research in this area. So with time, I'm sure more tools will be developed, and they will be developed and they will be improved. So we'll have better and better tools for dynamic assessment. But generally speaking, there are two forms of dynamic assessment, two approaches. One is to use a learning test. So learning tests are devised to assess learning potential. These tests have a structure of pre-test, and then the teaching component, and then the post-test. So again, the learning test, the goal of a learning test is to identify their learning potential. So that's one approach. Another approach is to use prompts. So this is called graduated prompt approach. So this approach refers to an assessment paradigm in which the extent of teaching needed for mastery and transfer is tracked. So this sounds very technical, but basically what you do is you provide a lot of support to children and see how well they can do with the prompts. So you give them multiple prompts and see when they can get the correct answer. I'll give you some examples on that in just a little bit. Okay, so so I will start with the learning test. So again, a learning test may consist of three components: a pre-test, an intervention, and then a post-test. And the intervention is typically individualized depending on the child's level. So the pre-test is the same as a static, it's a traditional test. So basically you find out what the child knows or doesn't know already, and then you provide an intervention. But this is different from a very long intervention. This intervention is given probably just in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, just to teach them something quickly and observe how well they learn. So a very brief intervention, and this intervention can be adapted to meet their individual needs, because for a child who knows a lot, you don't have to give a lot of intervention, but for a child who doesn't know much, then a little bit more intervention is needed. And then when that's done, you give them a post-test to see how well they do, how much they learned during this intervention. And oftentimes, now with computer technology, a learning test takes the format of a computerized program. So they use computer algorithms to determine sequences and content of instructional support. I'm sure all of you have the experience of playing computer games, right? And it's fun, it's motivating. And some games use this, we call it the self-adaptive technology. So if you're performing at very high level already, the game will give you more challenging items, right? To keep you motivated, and you can move to a higher level very quickly. If you're a beginner and if you're doing poorly, and the game will give you less challenging, will give you easy items so that you have more time to practice, and then you don't become discouraged. So actually a lot of computer games, like video games, are using this technology already, but it's still relatively rare when people use it for educational purposes. So parents, especially Chinese parents, often think, playing video games is a waste of time. I'd rather that my child spends all the time on schoolwork. but you can actually combine computerized programs with, with learning. We call them educational computer games. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about, because we're talking about dynamic assessment of language and literacy. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this game, so-called game that we developed in my lab to assess children's language skills. So the skill we're assessing here is called lexical specificity. It sounds very technical, but it's actually very straightforward. Basically, it means the ability to differentiate among words that sound similar. For example, you can have two words, bear and pear. So we call these minimal pairs because they only differ by one sound feature. And another example is, this is actually a pair that we use in our assessment, fo and so. So these words sound very similar to each other. So this, we call it lexical specificity, and it's an indicator of the quality of phonological representations of words in a child's mental lexicon. So imagine the child is learning to speak or learning to read. They have to be able to differentiate between these words that sound similar, right? Bear and pear, fo and so. If they can't tell the differences between these words, they will get confused. That's why having this lexical specificity is important for high quality phonological representations. If the quality of the representations is poor, then all of these words sound similar, then they constantly get confused in speech and then in reading. Another reason lexical specificity is important is because it's the foundation for phonological awareness, which is a very strong predictor of reading success. So phonological awareness is the ability to identify smaller units of sounds in a word. For example, when we hear the word cat, okay, cat is just one word. But how many sounds does this word have? You have to think about it without seeing the word. So we're talking about the word in the oral language. So when you hear the word cat, okay, it has actually three phonemes, three sounds, k, a, and t. And the ability to recognize that this word has three sounds is actually important for reading, because later, when you learn to read the word cat, you see exactly three letters. And then you can develop letter-sound correspondences, and these correspondences are really important for reading English, which is alphabetic language. Anyway, so without going too much detail into research, I just wanted to say that for these reasons, we wanted to assess children's lexical specificity, and we do it with dynamic methods. Okay. So we give it a name. We call it Ziggy's word game. So what you see is kind of in the form of a computer game, but it's not as well developed as some of the video games, so we're still working on it. But I'll just explain the rationale for it. Okay, so the goal is that children will be able to differentiate between the word fo and the word so. So these are minimal pairs, fo and so. But then we have a control word, bo, which is supposed to be a familiar word. Especially in Canada, in the English-speaking context, everybody knows what bo is. But they don't know fo or so, because these are challenging words for children. And the reason we chose these challenging words is because we're not interested in assessing their knowledge. We're interested in assessing how quickly they can learn these words, which is the point for dynamic assessment. So this game has 3 steps. It's fairly straightforward. In the first phase is learning phase. It has 2 learning phases. So in the first phase, they learn the word foe, and they contrast it with the word bow. So foe and bow, but they already know bow, that's a familiar word. And now they have to add a word that's unfamiliar, so everybody has to learn it. And it sounds similar to bow, but they have to be able to differentiate between foe and bow. So that's the first learning phase. And then in the second learning phase, they learn the word so, which also sounds similar to the word bow, but children didn't know it, so they have to learn it. So in the second phase, they learn so. So they have learning phase 1, learning phase 2, and then they're given the text phase. And in this phase, they have to compare and contrast the words foe and so. And these 2 words are both new words, and they sound similar to each other. So this is the testing phase. Okay, so this is how the game goes. So then I'll show you the pictures. Again, I don't claim this to be a perfect game. We're still working on it because it still has some problems. But it's based on the principle of dynamic assessment. So on the computer screen, they will see these 4 things, and 2 of them are just fillers. Like this is sink, this is hand. They're unrelated. So they will hear a voice that says, show me the foe. And then the child knows, oh, foe actually means, what does it mean? It means a little horse. And this is bow. Everybody knows bow. So now they have to tell, oh, foe and bow, they sound similar, but they're different. So that's learning phase 1. And then in learning phase 2, again, they see these 4 pictures, and there are 2 fillers. That's a tent. That's like a bird cage. And this is the control bow. And they hear the computer voice, show me the sole. And know, oh, sole is a kind of fish. That's how they learn the word sole. And they have to be able to tell sole and bow are different. They're not the same word. Okay, so they will do this for a couple times. And oh yeah, and we have a smiley face when they choose the correct answer. So they will have several trials to learn the 2 words. And then they enter the test phase. Here, you don't see bow anymore because that's the control word, but you see the 2 test words. You see so and foe. And now the task is to be able to differentiate between the 2 words. So the computer says, show me the foe. So you have to be able to tell, oh, that's the fish, not the horse. So that's the word game. So the idea is when we start a game, nobody knows the word foe or so. So everybody starts at the same starting point. It's not about knowledge. It's not about how much you know, because we teach you what you need to know. And then the idea is we give you several opportunities to learn these words, and then we test you and see how quickly you have learned. So we have 2 learning phases, and then we have a test phase. So that's the task. In my conference presentation, I'll actually present some empirical results. So how this task can be used to predict children's performance on phonological awareness, which is then related to their word reading ability. So from lexical specificity to phonological awareness, and then to word reading. And we do this both within English, within French, and also from English to French. So we measure their lexical specificity in English, which is their stronger language, and that's related to their phonological awareness in French and word reading ability in French. And because of this, we'll be able to assess children early when they just enter the French immersion program in grade 1. We don't have to wait until they're in grade 3 or grade 4 and they have gained more proficiency in French, because when you treat children with learning disabilities or reading disabilities, early intervention is very important. Okay, so that's one example. So that was the learning test. And now I'm going to show you some examples of the prompting method. So this is not from my own research. So this is from published research. So these people are my colleagues. I know them personally, but they have developed these dynamic assessment tools. So this is a dynamic assessment tool for phonological awareness. Again, it's the ability to recognize that a spoken word has smaller units of sounds. So you don't see it in the test, you just hear it. So this is a syllable deletion task. So say cowboy. Now say cowboy without cow. And the answer is boy, right? To us, it's very simple, but to children, especially very young children, it could be challenging. Also, this task goes from syllable to onset rhyme and then to phonemes. So you can say cat without k. And now it's more challenging. They have to be able to figure out, oh, cat has k, at. And say cat without k is at. So that's more challenging, but I'm just using this as example to show you how to do a dynamic measure. So when you do a standardized measure, you don't have any prompts, right? You basically say cowboy without cow, and then you record their answer, and that's it. But in a dynamic measure, you actually give them prompts. So if a student gives a correct answer to the question, that's it. You don't have to do anything else because they got it already. But if students give an incorrect response to the question, then you give them a series of prompts until the question is answered correctly. Well, some children will never be able to answer the question correctly, so eventually you have to stop. But typically, a dynamic measure will have, say, 3 or 4 or 5 prompts. So see how many prompts does it take before a child can answer the question correctly, and the number of prompts is used as an indicator of their learning potential, how quickly they can learn. So I'll just walk you through the steps here. So if a student answers this question incorrectly, you can repeat the initial example and then repeat the question. So just kind of show them how to do it. So, okay, remember the word sailboat without sail is boat. So now say cowboy without cow. So you give them an example and see if they can follow your example. So that's the first prompt. If they can do it, then great, you can stop there. But if they still can't do it, you give them another prompt. And here you can, so here in this task, they repeat the test item and they pause after the first syllable and then stress the remaining portion of the word. So just to make it very clear what the correct answer should be. So you can say cow, boy without cow. So you kind of, so you stress the 2 syllables. So to make it easier for them to remove the first syllable, or say sailboat without sail. So they may be able to get it. If they get it, and you stop there. If they still can't get it, you can give them another prompt. So in this prompt, they use a picture. So I just, on the internet, I found a picture of a sailboat. So you can actually point at the picture when you give them the item. You can say, okay, look at this picture, and sailboat. Now say sailboat without sail. And then with the help of the picture, they may get it. They may say boat. So, but it could be they still don't get it, so you can stop there. So the idea is a standardized measure only has one step, right? It's just the first step. say cowboy without cow, and then you record the score. But in a dynamic measure, you provide a series of 3 prompts to give them support and see how many prompts does it take for them to get the correct answer. And during this testing, you can also observe how they learn. Maybe for some children, it's okay just to show an example and they get it, right? They can't do cowboy, but if you show them how to do sailboat, they can get it. But some children, maybe that's not enough. Then you actually have to tell them the syllable structure, cow, boy, right? To tell them there are actually 2 syllables in this word. And for some of them, that's enough. They can get it. But some of them, they still may not get it. And then you can use other tools, such as pictures, to help them. So that's the idea of the prompting method. I'm going to show you another example. This is a different construct called morphological awareness. We're talking about language and literacy today. So both phonological awareness and morphological awareness are important for reading development. So morphological awareness is the ability to recognize that words actually have smaller units of meaning. So phonological awareness is the ability to recognize that a word has smaller units of sound. And morphological awareness is the ability to recognize that a word may have smaller units of meaning. So this is just the graph. Again, this task wasn't developed by me. It was by these colleagues here. I'm just giving it as an example. So basically, the task is about word meaning. So tell me what this word means. If they get it, you stop there. If they don't get it, you can give them, I think it's a total of 5 prompts to show them how to understand the meaning of this word. So I'm going to just take one word as example. So the word is equalize. So this is supposed to be a difficult word, a challenging word for children. So you just ask them, tell me what the word equalize means. Some children, they have a large vocabulary, a large mental lexicon. They get it. They know the word. They will tell you. But some children don't know. If it's a static test, you stop there. You either know or you don't know the meaning of this word. That's it. But when you're doing a dynamic measure, you give them prompts to help them understand the meaning of the word. And then you say, oh, okay, look at this word. Look at this word. Does this word have smaller parts? So they may say, yeah, it has equal in it. So some children may recognize that, okay? It has equal in it. Then you say, okay, now tell me what the word means. So maybe this will help them to understand that the meaning of equalize is related to equal, right? So that's morphological awareness, to understand that this word actually consists of 2 smaller parts, equal, and we call it the suffix, I-Z-E, it's a suffix, to make it a verb. Well, some children, that may be enough for some children. They see the word equal, and then they can tell you the meaning. So that's strategy, that's morphological awareness. But some children may not get it. They don't see any parts. And then you tell them, in the next prompt, you tell them, you say, look at this word. It actually has 2 parts. It has equal, and then it has eyes. And now tell me what the word means. And when you tell them the word actually has equal in it, explicitly, some children will say, okay, it means the same as equal, related to equal. But it's possible some children still don't get it. Then you keep going. You give them a sentence as to provide some context. So here is the sentence example. At the track meet, Josh ran extra fast so he could equalize his time with his opponents. Now tell me what the word equalize means. Well, some children will be able to infer the meaning of this word from the sentence, and you can stop there. Others still may not get it. So in the final step, you can give them options. You can ask them to choose. Okay, So now look at these options. Which option gives the meaning of the word equalize? Does it mean to increase? Does it mean to match? Or does it mean to decrease? So see if they can choose to match. So in this task, they have, a total of 5 prompts to help children figure out the meaning of this word. So that's a dynamic measure. So I have one more example, and this is interesting. So I have a collaborator in China, and over the years, she has designed some dynamic measure for Chinese children. So I asked her to share her task with me, and I picked one of them as an example. So again, this is ask children to read Chinese words. So in step 1, you can just ask them, say this word. How do you say it? It's tray, right? Some children will know it, others don't. Okay, if they don't know it, you show the traditional form, like the origin of the character. I'll actually go to the next slide so you can see more quickly. So the first step is when there's no prompt, they can say tray. If they can't do it, you can give them the first picture. You give them this picture, and then you say, look at this. 这个是树叶垂下来的样子，看看 to see whether they can know the word tray. Some people will know it, right? It's pretty obvious, but some children still struggle. And then you show them this picture, and you say, 看，这个是树叶在下垂，树叶下垂。Some children may get it, and some may not. And then if they don't get it, you can go to the next prompt. That's prompt 3. And then it draws the connection between the picture and the character. Basically, you're telling them how this character was created. 中间的一竖代表树干，横和2点代表树叶和下垂的叶子，最下面一横代表土地。And you can also use your finger to point. So this is the measure she designed to help children understand how this character was created, and also in this process, they will gain a better understanding about how to pronounce the character. And she has like a list of characters. I just picked a couple, like fu. So again, you show them the ancient form of the character, you show them the picture, and then you draw a connection between the form and the picture. So basically, I didn't know about this. So the character basically means 人像狗一样这样伏在地上，所以叫伏。Okay. Okay, we can keep going a little longer. So how are dynamic assessment tools used? Again, I show you some examples, but these are examples that researchers have come up, ideas researchers have come up with for dynamic assessment. I don't claim that those are perfect measures. It's a process, so we're working on the measures or trying to improve them and to design better measures. So I'll talk a bit more about the first point tomorrow. I'll show you how it works. So when you run a statistical model, you use a dynamic measure to predict an outcome. Say if I use the dynamic measure of lexical specificity to predict children's word reading ability, you will see that it actually predicts beyond static measures. So substantial research has shown that phonological awareness is related to word reading. There's no doubt about that. But now we can add phonological specificity. It predicts unique variance over and beyond phonological awareness. So it improves our prediction and make it more accurate. So here I should say that dynamic assessment is not meant to replace conventional testing. We're not saying that we should get rid of all of the standardized measures. Absolutely not. It's supposed to be used in combination with conventional testing to provide more information so the two can be used together. So when you assess children, you can assess their phonological awareness, but you can also assess their phonological or lexical specificity, and combined, these measures will provide more information about their word reading development. And because dynamic assessment has a teaching component, it can also be used as an intervention tool. So in some studies, they use dynamic assessment for intervention. Actually, that's also the goal for our research. For now, we use it for assessment to identify, to predict children's reading outcome, to identify risk readers or readers with dyslexia or reading disabilities. But eventually, when we have enough data, we want to design an educational game that children can play, and by playing the game, they can improve their lexical specificity. So that's like an end goal of our research. Okay, so I mentioned that already. So also for certain populations, such as low SE children, low SES children, and immigrant children, dynamic assessment provides more accurate information than static standardized assessment. And for bilingual children, dynamic assessment can be used in one language to predict outcome in the other language. So again, a lot of my research is done with children enrolled in French immersion programs in Canada. And because their French level proficiency is very poor in the early grades, we assess them in English, and we use their English performance to predict French outcomes. So we also use dynamic assessment to identify reading disabilities. I think I've covered all of these already. But there are some potential issues with dynamic assessment. It's not perfect. Obviously, it has strengths, but it also has problems. One problem, as you can see, is that it's very time-consuming. It takes a lot of time to do dynamic assessment because, for example, if you're using the prompting method, you give them a series of prompts that takes a long time. So if you're just giving a standardized measure, it can take, say, 10, 15 minutes. But if you use a dynamic measure, it might take 30 minutes or even 45 minutes. So it's a lot more time-consuming. Also, it requires more skill and training on teachers and researchers. A lot of teachers haven't even heard about dynamic assessment. If you ask them to do dynamic assessment, you have to train them. And sometimes, what our goal is for teachers to understand the concept of dynamic assessment and to even design their own dynamic assessment tools. But of course, it takes a lot of training. It's not so easy. And the final issue with dynamic assessment is reliability and validity. I don't know if you have a statistical background. So in research, when we give a measure, we also calculate the reliability of the measure to see how reliable the measure is. And it's a pretty standard procedure. But with dynamic assessment, with all the prompts, it's more difficult to carry out, to calculate reliability. Also, when you have several experimenters or several researchers or teachers giving the same dynamic measure, there will be more individual differences, right? Some people may spend more time on prompt 1 or 2. Some people may spend more time on prompt 3 and 4. Some people may be more patient than others. So that creates more individual variation. So just to say that dynamic assessment is useful, but it's not perfect. It also has problems. I just listed some questions for you guys. If you have experience with dynamic assessment, Do you have any experience? Do you feel confident? And what kind of training do you think is required for dynamic tools? So maybe we can sort of have a discussion. If you have questions, or yeah, we can have a brief discussion.